The fact that the number, I believe it's number 3 item in our budget every year now is financing on the debt. Number 1 is Social Security. Number 2, Medicare. Number 3, financing on our debt. That tells you something about sort of where we are going as a country and whether we're on a sustainable track. If you, as a country, want to be investing in things, whether it's investing in people, whether it's investing in defense, you're getting a service back. You're getting value back for that. When you're spending so much money just on financing the debt, you're not getting that value back. You're simply treading water with those dollars.
John Burks, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Roger.
It's wonderful to have you on Reaganism. For our listeners and viewers, you are now with the Bipartisan Policy Center, where you serve as the Executive Vice President for Economic and Health Policy. Previously, you were a Vice President of Global Public Policy at Walmart, and then you and I got to know each other from our days on Capitol Hill, where I think your last position was as Chief of Staff to the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. Welcome back to Think Tank Land. How's it going for you?
I am loving it. It is great to be, a warrior for good ideas, and that is one of the things I always loved about President Reagan, and I love about the Reagan Institute is the passion for policy and the passion for trying to make this a better country.
Well, part of doing that is really getting others to join with you, be it within the party or across parties, kind of the politics of addition. Just give us a quick background on the Bipartisan Policy Center, sort of the state of the country right now. You probably get some eye rolls. You probably get people, kind of sighing, saying, Bipartisan Policy Center probably just means this guy, John Burks, is squishy. Why should we be reassured about where you are right now and what you're doing and not hold the fact that you're at the Bipartisan Policy Center against you?
Well, it's I've gone from being a crazy right-winger when I first started on the Hill to, the squishy middle, I guess. But for me, it's all been the same in terms of being in favor of policies that enable people to have, make choices for themselves and pursue their economic freedom and economic lives. And so the great thing about what we do here at the Bipartisan Policy Center is that it's not the nonpartisan policy center. It's not the idea that we're simply going to, find a squishy compromise position. It's about figuring out what the right answer is and then building a bipartisan consensus around it. And so my teams work in sort of 2 areas, as you noted: economic policy, where we focus a lot on fiscal policy, retirement policy, and government operations. And then on the health policy side, where we think a lot about questions about how to make the healthcare system more affordable and about how innovation in healthcare can improve outcomes and improve the affordability of the system. So it's an exciting place to be.
Well, you're a dangerous person because not only are you doing this health policy, the economic policy, but you and I got to know each other working on national security, foreign policy, and defense issues, which you know a heck of a lot about as well. Today, for our listeners and viewers, we won't get John Burks' perspective on the foreign policy, national security, and defense issues. We'll focus on the economic policy. I have to have you back another time to do the health policy. But this is a bit of a challenge, John. I mean, almost you could say, the pushing a boulder uphill. Sisyphean challenge, mispronouncing it, but you know where I'm going on this. The idea that we can come up with a bipartisan framework to deal with the fiscal challenges our country is dealing with. I want to talk to you about Social Security in particular, the issues of debt and deficit. What do you tell a skeptical ear, be it a senator, a congressman, an administration official, a donor, right, or just someone you meet outside the Beltway or maybe inside the Beltway, that on economic policy we might be able to realize a durable bipartisan solution? I appreciate the distinction you made a moment ago. This is actually not lowest common denominator stuff. We're actually trying to get the best policy outcome. That could also be politically relevant. For so long, if you actually try to do something on the issues that I just outlined, you might have the right policy outcome, and you could probably get Republicans and Democrats to agree on it, but it's not going to be viable politically.
Yeah. No, you're exactly right, Roger. I think the reality of our moment is that so many things that are bipartisan end up being things that are easy, if you will. So it's relatively easy to get agreement about how to increase the deficit. It's relatively difficult to find bipartisan agreement about how to reduce it. But the reality of where we are today, where we have trillion-dollar deficits forecast throughout the decade, approaching $2 trillion by the end of the decade, the math simply doesn't work long term for us to continue on this course. And I think, based on conversations we're having with members of Congress, there's a growing recognition that we have to do something about that. One piece of that is going to be needs to be spending reductions, and one piece of that needs to be more revenue. And so, really, it is about helping members of Congress work through the reality of the math. Because once you get them to understand the reality that you can't continue to have spending growing faster than the economy, once you get them to understand that you can't have spending or have revenues declining as a share of the economy at the same time, they get to okay, so we've got to figure out some solutions. And they recognize that politically, the only way to do that is to do it together. Otherwise, it becomes weaponized. Otherwise, it becomes a political issue. And so if they're able to come together, if you're able to demonstrate to them that there is, in fact, a bipartisan consensus around a given policy, it allows them to move forward together in a way that's politically safe.
Give us some context here. What is the size of the U.S. debt? What are we looking at here?
Yeah, so the easiest way to think about it is relative to how much our economy puts out each year. So our gross domestic product each year, let's just say that's say $20 trillion. Our debt is essentially equal to that today. We are essentially each year we have an income of about 20. We have our income, and the debt level is equal to that, and it's growing. And so that means that our ability to finance future investments is increasingly challenged because we don't have the resources on hand to do it without further deficit financing. So to put it in a family analogy, if your income were such that you were making $100 a year, but your debt level was $110 and growing every year, you'd be worried about your ability to continue that on for the long term. So a lot of us have mortgages. That's a lot of money for all of us. But we're paying it down. The debt's moving in the right direction. The problem for the United States is that we have this massive amount of debt, and rather than getting it under control and reducing the level of it, instead we're adding to it each year. We're adding another $2 trillion every year.
So one of the things I said we wouldn't talk about defense, but I will do it just in this one moment only, John, and that is we have crossed this threshold, which is pretty consequential as you think about economies and strengths, the kind of economies and their strength and as an indicator. And that is, does a country spend more on financing its debt than it does on its national defense? And the United States crossed that threshold, I think last year, certainly last year, maybe the year prior, where we are spending more to finance that debt, which is roughly around $36 trillion or so, than we are spending on our national defense. And our allies in Europe are pretty much doing the same now.
Yep.
Of course, this gets particularly difficult when we're in an inflationary environment.
Yep.
Why is that significant? How do you think about it? As somebody who thinks both about foreign policy and national security, and I view you as a fellow defense hawk,
Yep.
so you're not somebody who's looking to see the defense budget go down.
Yep.
Yet, it's not healthy, I think, for us to be spending more on our debt financing.
Yeah, no, you said it well. The fact that the number, I believe it's number 3 item in our budget every year now is financing on the debt. Number 1 is Social Security. Number 2, Medicare. Number 3, financing on our debt. That tells you something about sort of where we are going as a country and whether we're on a sustainable track. If you, as a country, want to be investing in things, whether it's investing in people, whether it's investing in defense, you're getting a service back. You're getting value back for that. When you're spending so much money just on financing the debt, you're not getting that value back. You're simply treading water with those dollars. And so we have to, as a nation, get to a point where we are not, spending so much money on debt. And the reality is, we built up the debt a lot during a period of very low interest rates. So coming out of the financial crisis and basically for the last 15 years or so, interest rates have been historically low. They're now returning to historically normal levels. And that return means that the cost of financing this massive debt is growing. So it's no longer, we had time. We could have taken steps to get our fiscal house in order in a way that allowed us to continue making investments in important things. We're running out of that time. We're now at a point where we really do have very difficult choices we're going to have to make in order to keep our fiscal house in order and not to end up in the circumstance where so many countries are of rising debt, consuming itself.
So, difficult choices. I want to get to that in a minute. I actually wonder how difficult some of these choices have to be. Particularly, I'm thinking about Social Security. But before we get there, you mentioned at the outset, we might have to reduce the amount of spending, right? We might have to increase revenue, taxes and the like. What about tariffs? There are a bunch of rash kind of arguments the administration has put forward in terms of their tariff policy, set aside what the Supreme Court may or may not do. Let's just argue that the Trump administration tariff regime can remain in place, that it's lawful or not unlawful. John, is it a credible means to reducing our deficit because of the amount of money we're going to get in from the tariff revenue? In other words, do you consider a persuasive argument, hey, tariffs are good in part because now we're bringing in revenue and we can reduce our overall spending as a result?
So I guess let me answer that in two ways.
Yeah.
First, let's think about it in terms of what tariff revenue has meant for the government historically. It's been about 1% of our revenues in the post-war context. So that's, not insignificant, but it's not enough to really move the needle on the big deficit and debt challenge. We now have a series of tariffs that the president has imposed, and like you said, well, let's just assume for the sake of conversation that these are going to stay in place over the long term. The administration's sort of most aggressive estimate of how much revenue that's going to generate is that it's going to be, say, around $4 trillion over the next 10 years. That is about how much we reduced taxes by in the reconciliation bill that passed in July. So in other words, it's about offsetting the tax bill that happened in July. And so instead of being on a course where we're going to have annual deficits of $2 trillion every year, we would be back to a course where we have annual deficits of about $1.7 trillion every year. So it's not insignificant, but at the same time, it doesn't solve the problem.
Got it. So best case scenario, about $400 billion a year. It's not really going to do anything because we're taking in less in terms of revenue from taxes in light of the big, beautiful bill. Yep. And therefore, from a debt standpoint, you really haven't addressed that problem. When $1.7 trillion, a year is just not going to be enough to get at this $36 trillion behemoth of a problem.
Exactly, and and then you have to think about as well: is this the most efficient way to raise taxes? Because that's what it is. It's a tax on imports, and is this the way that is going to lead to economic growth? Is this the way that's going to support industry, blossoming in this country, creating good jobs, allowing sort of that virtuous cycle of growth? And the evidence thus far suggests it's not. So, you would think that if the goal of the tariffs is to protect domestic manufacturing and to lead to this manufacturing renaissance, you would expect job growth in manufacturing. And instead, what we've seen over since January of this year is that we've lost nearly 80,000 jobs in manufacturing here in the United States. You would expect that you would see domestic production sharply up as people work to avoid the tariffs. And instead, it's up modestly. It's about a 1%, which is basically the trend from before the tariffs were imposed. And so, the reality of what we're seeing the tariffs do in terms of supporting economic growth just isn't supportive of the idea that these tariffs are an efficient way of going after the
just pursue this a little bit more, right? I mean, that's an argument. It's certainly an argument you're hearing a lot because in the jobs report that came out for August, only 22,000 jobs, and it was sort of healthcare and areas where government is paying for much of that, but manufacturing, as you point out, is not where the jobs are coming from. Two follow-up points I'd love to respond to. One, I can see someone from the Trump administration saying, hey, Burks, it's too soon, right? We're not going to see the effects of the tariff policy, until we're a year plus into this, and then we'll start seeing those manufacturing jobs ramp up. And then number two, you could also I would expect they'd make the argument, listen, there's a lot of uncertainty. We have these courts that are trying to strike us down. They don't like the statutory basis, IEPA, being the basis for our tax policy, and Liberation Day needs to be something that people are confident is here to stay. We get those questions resolved, then we'll start seeing, the capital go into manufacturing here in the United States.
Yeah, I think it is a fair point that the uncertainty is a big factor right now. That's actually, I would argue, a reason why the right way to go about this kind of policy, if you think it is the right policy, is to go to Congress and get the law changed, because that's the only way you can ultimately have certainty in this space. And again, that means bipartisanship. It means you go out and you persuade people that this is, in fact, the policy that you ought to be pursuing. But the reality of the uncertainty surrounding these tariffs, whether that's uncertainty driven by the president's policy decisions. I mean, the courts have only over the last couple of months gotten engaged in a meaningful way in this. And so there's a lot of uncertainty that came out of the president and sort of how he was using the tariffs. But then the uncertainty around the courts and sort of the legality of how these have been imposed, again, is another source of uncertainty. And then you look overall at the effects, and unfortunately what you see is that domestic investment, so investment in things like plant and equipment that ultimately, are the basis for which manufacturing jobs, blossom from, that investment's down. And so the
John Deeres of the world are not buying the stuff, right?
Yeah,
that they need
exactly.
because
They don't know what the environment's going to look like. They don't believe that their access to foreign markets is being improved by the tariffs and the negotiations that the president is undertaking. And so it is not an environment in which executives and companies are making decisions that the best course for them is to manufacture here.
Quick excursion. This pulls on your time in the legislative branch. I didn't note at the outset you have a distinguished career in the executive branch too, serving in the Bush 43 administration. But to pull the thread a little bit on the Burks outlook on the legislative branch, given you were pretty much the most senior staff role one could have in the Congress. That's my diss on the U.S. Senate. It's the chief staff to Speaker of the House.
I love the Senate, for the record.
Yeah, I know. Well, I know you spend time there too. But you left the Senate to go back to the House. You went back to the people. There is this notion of the non-delegation doctrine, and it's something that the Supreme Court may choose to take up, which is, summarizing it, since I'm a lawyer, I'll state it, this idea that there are some authority or some powers that reside only with the legislative branch, Article 1 of the Constitution, and that Article 2 can't sort of carry out any authority unless it was something authorized by the Congress, and tariffs are one of those. And you served on the Ways and Means Committee, which, of course, is the most powerful committee in the House of Representatives and the Congress.
After the House Armed Services Committee. Let's get that straight, Roger.
Thank you. You're kind for accommodating that. But I actually suffered under the reign of the Ways and Means Committee telling me when I had a policy measure that actually was a revenue unbeknownst to me. But my point here is this something in your view, John Burks, that the court will come down and say, hey, the non-delegation doctrine applies, that the Congress needs to really specifically sort of delegate this authority, in the absence of a specific statute, President Trump was actually doing something that only Article 1 the Congress can carry out?
Yeah. Well, I am unburdened by a law degree, so happy to offer my opinion.
Yeah, well, there we go. It makes you more qualified.
I think whether it's the non-delegation doctrine, whether it's major questions doctrine, I think there's a lot of reasons to doubt that Congress thought they were granting the president sort of plenary authority to set tariff rates essentially with no process whatsoever. So there's a lot of reasons to think that this is probably in excess of the president's statutory authority. But I think the more interesting question in a lot of ways is the policy one about whether it's the right policy or not. And I think the president has done a lot, frankly, to persuade members of Congress who were skeptical of tariff policy that perhaps this is a route worth pursuing. And so, I think there's even if the courts were to rule tomorrow that this is, the president has been acting beyond his statutory authority, I think there's a non-zero chance that were he to go pursue this in Congress, he could get it done.
Yeah. It's interesting that the Congress overall, not just in this question of tariffs, but a trend, even when you and I were there and before, was quite comfortable putting the hard issues before the president. So a lot of discussion here about President Trump's assertion of executive power. The unitary executive existed before President Trump came to office this go-around, or even the last go-around, and presidents of both parties. So I'll channel a little bipartisan policy center moment here. Have definitely we've seen presidents take authority that Congress was not willing to take for themselves.
Yeah.
This is part of the problem here.
Yeah. Well, my first job in politics was working for a fellow who had been the senior associate counsel for President Reagan. So Chris Cox, congressman from Orange County, California. And so I've long been personally a believer in a strong executive. But that's not to mean that you should have a weak Congress. And so, I think there's a real question about how much Congress is standing up for its prerogatives in the policy process. And, ultimately, as the branch that is closest to the people, as the branch that is most politically accountable due to frequent elections, it starts with the House and standing up and saying, these are prerogatives we have to determine what the level of taxation is, what the level of spending is, and obviously the president has to sign these things into law, and therefore you have to come to agreement. But it's our system of government depends on a division of power between the branches. It depends on the branches each being jealous of their prerogatives. And so, hopefully we're in a moment where Congress is ready to assume more responsibilities that are granted to you in the Constitution.
Well, let's hope that's not a strategy. But here's the reality, is that Congress needs to act soon on the debt ceiling. And this is something that anytime...
You mean the government shutdown? Keep
government shutdown, correct.
Yeah.
And then eventually there'll be a requirement, I believe, on the, well, I guess the debt ceiling was resolved.
Yeah, they did the
with
debt ceiling back
bill.
there in One Big Beautiful.
So we're going to have the government shutdown face us here shortly. Congress can't sort of wiggle its way out of that one. The way we dealt with it last go around is we had a continuing resolution. For those who think about debt and deficit, like, okay, well, a continuing resolution probably is a good outcome because we're spending at the same levels. What's the response to that? Why or why not is spending at the same levels of continuing resolution not, or perhaps the review is a good way to kind of get cap and make sure we're not spending too much?
Yeah, well, I think it starts off with a little, Federal Budget 101. So only about a third of the federal budget has to be approved every year. So 2/3 of it is already on autopilot. That's things like Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid. So regardless of whether or not Congress acts, that just keeps going. The third that is that is annually appropriated, it's called discretionary spending. About half of that's defense, about half of it's non-defense. And the reality is that, when you are running $1.7 trillion deficits, that third of the budget is important, but it's not, keeping it flat isn't going to solve your problem. The second thing to keep in mind is that the spending decisions that in this case would have been made when Joe Biden was president in 2023 are probably not appropriate to the circumstances that we're going to face in 2026.
You say because the continuing resolution keeps everything in place in the previous year. So if I'm spending money on apples in 2023, even though I need oranges, I'm continuing to spend on apples because that's the rules of the road.
Exactly. So, and in this case, because we've had a continuing resolution for the entire year already, so we've already done this once, we decided in 2023 we needed 10 apples. Well, in 2023 we bought those 10 apples. 2024 we bought 10 more apples, and and then this coming year we're going to buy 10 more apples if we continue on a continuing resolution. That may work in places that are largely sort of salary driven, so like an agency is not going to grow. But in a place like the Defense Department, where the needs of the needs of meeting the defense burden, the scheduled procurement of fighter aircraft or ships or whatever changes year to year.
It's highly dynamic.
It's exactly. It doesn't make sense to keep on with decisions that literally were made 2 years ago.
So, one of the most important figures in the Trump administration on these sorts of questions of spending, questions of budget strategy, is Russ Vought, the director of OMB. He may be the most impactful director of the Office of Management and Budget in its history.
Yeah.
I think
Probably since Stockwell. I mean, if we're being honest.
Right. Wait, Reagan Stockman.
Stockman, excuse me, Stockman, yeah.
David Stockman.
Yep.
Could be. Yeah, and I think the only person who's had it twice in sort of two different administrations as opposed to two
that's right.
success administrations. But yeah, people like George Shultz, Cap Weinberger. I mean, this is sort of distinguished people have had this role on the Democratic side. Jack Lew. I mean, there are some budget whizzes who've had this job, but he seems to be unique in terms of really driving some very consequential policy outcomes through this role, and importantly for any sort of cabinet post, has the ear of the president and seems to have the runway the president is giving him. Do you think, from a Trump administration standpoint, a continuing resolution is an outcome they're willing to live with for a second year in a row?
Wow, that's a tough one. Because on
Did I
on the one
stump
hand,
Burks? I stumped Burks. That's exciting.
I know. I think on one hand, if you are an administration, again, going back to sort of Congress and Congress's role in sort of setting up these rules, the sort of standing rules around what happens under a continuing resolution give the president some flexibility, especially, and you can write in more flexibility into a CR. And so you might choose to say, you know what, I can live with the overall spending level, and if Congress is willing to give me a little bit of flex, I can make this work. And that's a difficult environment to reach a negotiated settlement if at the outset the one party is going and saying, I don't really need to come to an agreement. So, I don't know. I haven't talked to Russ about this. We do engage with the administration on an ongoing basis, but I haven't talked to Russ to get his view on whether a CR is an acceptable outcome from them, but I wouldn't rule it out.
Yeah, I mean, my sense on this is looking at the political landscape and knows, I'll get a little more kind of nerd out with you on budgets here for a second. So for this is a trigger warning for listeners and viewers who don't want to go see too deep inside the Beltway. But here's a few things going on from the Office of Management and Budget, if I'm imagining what's going on between the ears of Director Vaught. He's looking at the politics and thinks, if I just go the normal way of bipartisan compromise on appropriations bills, generally the trend is we end up having to spend more money. So I'm going to actually drive more money into the agencies that, from a Trump administration standpoint, I want to spend less on. That's point one. Point two, he's experimenting first time in generations with rescissions. This idea that I'm going to take appropriated dollars out of those continuing resolutions, and I'm just not going to spend it in the way that Congress has directed us to spend. And my sense is they think they can win the day in the courts on this, that there's some precedent to rely on, but it's a TBD. So now not only have I capped spending at continuing resolution levels, now I'm actually spending less through actually not spending the money that Congress has appropriated. And then here's the kicker, number three, is that they have a mechanism, which you did when you were Chief of Staff to Speaker Ryan, which is a reconciliation bill. Mm-hmm. They did it once, and we'll see if they do it again in 2025. That is calendar year 25, fiscal year 2026, where with just simple majorities in the House and the Senate, they can actually spend in their priorities and don't have to go through the traditional appropriations process. In shipbuilding, for example, and other defense priorities, that's the way we've actually seen a Republican administration keep spending low in the areas they don't want to spend on and have been able to realize increased spending in national defense, something that I fully support, as a defense hawk. To me, that's kind of a good strategy from their perspective.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that from their perspective. I guess the best I could do in sort of making the case for a bipartisan agreement is that ultimately, if you want to build something that takes more than 1 year to do, you'd like to know, especially something that relies on the private sector to make investments and to make commitments and to be a partner in realizing those goals. Having bipartisan agreement around it allows you to do that with confidence. It allows you to get a company to, whether it's a Lockheed or General Dynamics or whomever, to invest in a new shipyard, to invest in a new production line, to enable the, spending around a presidential priority. if you do it sort of year by year, you do it in a process that is purely partisan, you really do increase the political risk that you're asking your partners to take on, and that's a real impediment to investment.
Yeah, and that ultimately, if others, you don't have that buy-in from, the economy, the people that drive the economy, the entities that drive the economy, then you're not realizing those objectives, even if you've solved the difficult politics of getting things done with narrower majorities. Let's take the balance of our time and shift to the 2/3 of the budget that really seems to matter as you focus on our economic health and debt and deficit. And the one I want to hone in on is Social Security. And I hadn't really focused on this until preparing for our conversation. I knew that it was sort of the largest bill we pay on an annual basis. We knew people talk about, hey, this is the sort of thing that we got to solve for Social Security because we're not going to be able to pay for it at a certain point down the road here, not too far off, but not tomorrow, like 2030s or something. But I didn't realize we're spending on Social Security about $1.5 trillion a year.
Yep.
And then this goes back to one other point, that the policy doesn't seem so sophisticated or difficult from where I sit, which is just delay the age in which someone receives Social Security, not for people that are expecting it today or even tomorrow, but for people who are not expecting it for 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
And you might be able to solve part of this. Take us through this, but for some reason the politics are just impossible around this.
Yeah, you're right, Roger. I think the policy solutions around Social Security are relatively well known. There's actually a fair degree of agreement around across the political spectrum of the policy wonks about sort of how you would do it. As you noted, a piece of it would need to be delaying the retirement age. So for those who are able-bodied, the fact is the normal retirement age has been rising a couple of months a year, coming out of the 83 Social Security deal, and accelerating that so that you have to match the trends in longevity. That's a big piece of solving this. You probably also need to do something on the revenue side in order to match the reality that we have longer life spans, and so people are going to be retired longer, even with a higher.
So you
retirement.
mean what I pay into Social Security perhaps needs to be adjusted because I'm going to be drawing for longer than originally anticipated?
Yes.
Okay.
And so, if the balance of sort of working years to retirement years is going to remain unchanged, then you certainly need to, given that we have longer lifespans, you're going to need to pay in more to the system.
Contextualize that for us, and I'm asking you for numbers here. You can give us just back of the envelope stuff, but is this if I'm putting it, how much am I putting in on a per paycheck basis as a percentage, and is that going up multiple percent or decimals? What are we looking at here?
Yeah, so the employee side of the payroll tax is about 6.2%. I want to say off the top of my head, and then the employer matches that as well. Economically, that all comes out of your compensation,
sure,
so it's about 12%. And the amount that it would have to go up depends on how aggressive you are on other benefit changes. So whether it's a percentage point, 2 percentage points, really differs depending on how aggressive you are with retirement age, what other changes you might make in the benefit formula. Because obviously, you and I, we have relatively sedentary jobs that we hopefully will be able to do well into our 60s and 70s. That's not always going to be the case for someone who works construction or someone who works with their body on a regular basis. And so you probably want to make some changes to make the benefit a little bit more rich for that person who just because they're not going to be able to continue working longer into older age. So there's a lot of variables there, but it's not it is not a massive increase in taxes necessary in order to achieve a balanced package. And so we were actually in the field with some public opinion research.
Yeah, tell us about that. I was surprised to see how much support there is for actually solving this problem, given the difficulty of getting a political solution. Yeah,
it's funny. On a bipartisan basis, people recognize there is a problem. They recognize that acting on the problem sooner than later is probably a better idea. And they recognize that, yes, there's going to need to be a balanced approach to this that affects both benefits and taxes. And so that's just the American people are pretty adult, pretty mature about a lot of things if you just level with them. And so, part of what we're trying to do is help politicians recognize that reality and sort of build on a bipartisan basis that some confidence that if you come out and say you're willing to fix Social Security so that it is available for the long term, that it's not going to be weaponized against you.
All right, so explain this to me. This is the kicker, because two things you've shared right now. One, the policy solutions are not particularly complicated, and we can imagine they can be done in a fashion that people can support, right? I'm happy to say that my child, who is under 10 years old, is going to have to work a little bit longer before he or she gets Social Security, and maybe it's a couple percentage points higher than I'm paying today. And you're saying the American people, I think what I saw, 83% think addressing the problems should be a top priority for Congress. In other words, they want Congress to get after it. 83% support that. It's hard to find 83% of anybody in this country agreeing about anything.
Yeah.
And yet, we can't get our elected officials to focus on this. I'll add one more to just on the yet side, right? I think about one moment during the Biden administration when President Biden got a bipartisan applause during a State of the Union or a joint session, I can't remember which it was, where he basically said something to the effect of, and we're going to keep our hands off your entitlements. In other words, we're not going to touch Social Security. And it was in that moment, Jonathan, you recall, that not only did Democrats get up and applaud, which is to be expected, Republicans applauded for Joe Biden, too.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's one of those things that it's easy to sort of take the applause line, do the applause line in that moment. But the reality is that under current law, unless changes are made to Social Security, within a decade, we're going to have benefit cuts. That's under current law. And so Congress is going to have to act in order to protect beneficiaries. And so that's just the reality of the moment. And so helping members of Congress grow confident that the policy solutions are in fact doable, that they are not toxic, that this is not a third rail, is one of our missions here at BPC. Why
wouldn't a Trump administration take this up?
Well, I think there actually is a chance of that. I mean, the fact is
really?
that I think President Trump is the kind of guy who has demonstrated a willingness to take on big things, to be the guy who says only I can do it. And so, part of what we would like to do is convince him that only he can solve Social Security. That, one of the things that would make him a president that is long remembered for having been consequential is a, bipartisan statutory fix to Social Security to prevent really big benefit cuts that are going to occur unless Congress and the president act.
What does it do to the debt and deficit, too? So, one, it goes insolvent, but two, we bend the cost curve, we reduce the amount we pay to service the debt, too, right? So there's just sort of the fiscal health side of it as well, not just the program, but the fiscal health of the country. They interact.
Absolutely. If you get to the point where Social Security is no longer being a net addition to the deficit, that is a big piece of getting our fiscal house in order. You still have to deal with the growth of healthcare spending, which I know we don't have time for today, but I think, but this is a big piece of getting our fiscal house in order, getting Social Security right, so that beneficiaries who are dependent on Social Security get the benefits they expect, and that we solve this problem for the long term.
Last question before we go to lightning round, but this would seem to be the low-hanging fruit. Meaning, if I go over to President Trump and say, "Hey, we got two big drivers that are really impacting the debt and the deficit, and we're borrowing from the world, right, to do this, but it's just not healthy and it's putting our economy at risk. It's healthcare or Social Security." Healthcare, you get all the baggage of Obamacare, and it's a complicated regulatory regime and a business regime. I mean, you need many sessions to cut through that. Whereas Social Security, again, is a lot more simple to deal with. Am I overstating the matter?
No, I think that's exactly true. We're hopeful to get progress on both, because ultimately you do have to deal with both sides of it in order to get the fiscal house in order overall. But a great first step, and one that would be historic, would be really addressing Social Security's impending shortfall.
Wow, I mean, you really went for the trifecta here, going to the Bipartisan Policy Center. You are dealing with the two biggest drivers of debt and deficit at heart: Social Security, right? You got the health care, and they have to do it in a bipartisan way. Well, only the whiz kid John Burks could solve this. Let's go to our lightning round. Here's where we ask all our guests to share their favorite Reagan book, quote, and or speech.
Well, for book, I'm going to go with the Peacemaker by our friend Willem Bowden, really about Reagan's foreign policy legacy. Obviously the Soviet Union collapses during the presidency of his successor, Bush 41. But, Reagan deserves a ton of credit for the savvy and strategic and persistent approach he took to ending the Cold War and winning it. And I think Will does a masterful job
Great
of
book.
laying it all out.
Amazing book. All right. Quote, speech, what do you got?
Well, quote, it's hard to go for any place but the Brandenburg Gate, 1987. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And, the amazing thing to me about that is that Reagan was invested in his relationship with Gorbachev. But he didn't fall into the trap of letting that investment stop him from speaking truth or stop him from pressing, his interlocutor for a better world. Too often, I've seen politicians who say, "Oh, we can't talk to foreign leader X about that. That'll sour the relationship." And Reagan knew that no, demonstrate strength, speak truth, and that gives you power in that relationship. And so, it's amazing.
I love that point. That's we've had others share that quote in speech, but that's a particularly good gloss on it.
Yeah. And finally, for the speech, I'm going to go with his closing address as president. I happened to see it this morning in one of the newsletters, and I think it's incredibly apt. And in the speech, he says, "A man wrote me and said, quote, 'You can go to live in France, but you cannot become a Frenchman. You can go to live in Germany or Turkey or Japan, but you cannot become a German, a Turk, or a Japanese. But anyone from any corner of the earth can come to live in America and become an American.'" And that reality, that America is about ideas, that America is about freedom, that America is about opportunity, and that if you are willing to invest in those ideas and values, that you too can be an American, is just such a powerful one to me. So,
yeah, I definitely think it's what makes us exceptional. Jonathan Burks of the Bipartisan Policy Center, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Roger. It was great here talking to you.